Teacher, look, the janitor's leaving food for that quiet kid again. A student's voice rang out across the schoolyard, half mocking, half curious. Sam Miller, the old janitor in faded coveralls, said nothing. He just smiled softly, set the sandwich on the stone bench, and turned away with his mop cart as he had done for months. But 1 week later, everything changed. The entire school froze. Through the front gates marched a formation of Marines' boots crisp on the pavement dress. Blues gleaming under the sun, each one stopped, and with perfect precision raised a salute. Not to the principal, but to the janitor. Who was this quiet boy, Eli Thompson? And why had a simple janitor earned such profound gratitude from the United States Marine Corps? Sam Miller was the kind of man you could pass a dozen times in a day and never really notice, and that was just fine with him. At 69, Sam carried himself with the quiet humility of a man who had long ago made peace with who he was and what he'd lived through. His wiry frame, weathered hands, and stooped shoulders told the story of decades of hard work, but it was his eyes, a soft gray blue, still sharp beneath a battered ball cap, that revealed the layers most people missed. Sam was a former American Marine transport specialist, a veteran who had once navigated convoys through the thick jungles and treacherous roads of past war zones. He had served during some of the American military's most dangerous years, ferrying supplies, evacuating civilians, and pulling stranded Marines from hot zones when others hesitated. Back then, Sam was known for his calm under pressure, his stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind, and his instinct for finding the safest path when chaos reigned. But those were stories few in Oakridge, Tennessee had ever heard, because Sam didn't tell them. After returning home from military service, Sam had slipped back into civilian life with little fanfare. He didn't join the local veterans groups, didn't march in parades, and didn't hang his medals on the wall. He moved quietly through life, working jobs that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, mechanic, truck driver, handyman. Eventually, when his knees began to complain and his back reminded him of years spent carrying too much weight, he took a job as the janitor at Oakridge Elementary, a small school in the heart of rural Tennessee. There, among the hum of school bells, the squeak of sneakers on polished floors, and the occasional laughter of children, Sam found a kind of peace. The school staff knew Sam as reliable to a fault. He was the first to arrive each morning, unlocking the doors, sweeping the walkways, and making sure the sidewalks were salted in the winter. If the heat went out or the pipes froze, Sam was the one they called, and he always came. He patched leaky faucets, fixed jammed lockers, and replaced flickering lights without being asked. The children knew him as the old man in the gray coveralls pushing his mop cart down the hallways with a nod and a faint smile. He rarely spoke, but he always greeted the kids with a quiet morning kiddo or a wink as they passed. He was the one who handed out Band-Aids when they scraped their knees or offered a hand steadying a wobbly science project. Yet despite his constant presence, Sam remained mostly invisible to the adults around him. What they didn't see or didn't think to ask was how much his military past still shaped the man he was. Sam never stopped living by the codes he'd learned as a Marine. To him, duty wasn't just something you clocked in for. It was a way of moving through the world. You showed up early, you stayed until the job was done, and you watched out for the people who couldn't watch out for themselves. In many ways, the school became his new unit. The principal, Mrs. Caldwell, was a fine officer in Sam's eyes, organized, fair, and decisive. The teachers were the backbone, doing work that was harder and more exhausting than most civilians realized, in the students. To Sam, they were the reason you pulled extra duty without complaint. They were the ones you protected from broken playground equipment, from icy sidewalks, from the small dangers no one else seemed to notice. Sam lived alone in a modest 2-room apartment a few blocks from the school. His furniture was simple, the walls unadorned except for a single black and white photo of his unit, taken during his American Marine service. He didn't own a car, preferring to walk each morning through the quiet streets of Oakridge, with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a lunchbox in the other. His evenings were often spent repairing old radios or reading worn paperbacks passed to him by the school librarian. Though Sam was humble almost to a fault, his presence at Oakridge Elementary was a steadying force. In a world where people came and went, where teachers transferred, students graduated, and even principals moved on, Sam remained. His quiet acts of service formed the invisible glue that held the school together, even if few people realized it. But underneath the quiet routine, something else stirred in Sam. He had seen the cost of neglect, of people falling through the cracks, of promises broken. It was why, without ever announcing it, he started watching out for Eli Thompson. The thin, quiet boy who always sat alone, whose lunch was never quite enough, whose eyes carried a sadness Sam recognized from long ago. In many ways, Sam Miller had spent his life doing the same thing over and over, making sure no one was left behind. And though his battlefield had changed, his mission never had. Eli Thompson was the kind of boy who could disappear in plain sight. At 9 years old, he had already mastered the quiet art of slipping through a school day without drawing attention. No easy feat in a bustling elementary school where children bounced off the walls like pinballs. But Eli had learned through circumstances far beyond his control that sometimes it was safer and easier to keep your head down. A fourth grader at Oakridge Elementary, Eli was new to the school, though new was a word he was all too familiar with. In just 2 years, he and his mother had moved through 3 towns and 2 states each time, leaving behind a classroom full of unfamiliar faces and a house that never quite felt like home. His parents' divorce had been the first earthquake that split his world, but the aftershocks, the late-night arguments, the financial strain, the hurried relocations were what left the deeper cracks. At school, Eli sat quietly in the back row, close to the window. His brown hair always seemed to fall into his eyes, and his shirts hung a little too loose on his narrow frame. His backpack, faded, at the seams, was usually half-zipped, the corners of crumpled paper sticking out. And while other children unpacked lunches filled with peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and juice boxes, Eli often sat with a single granola bar or a packet of crackers, making them last as long as he could. But it wasn't just his appearance that set him apart, it was his silence. Eli rarely raised his hand in class, rarely joined games at recess, and rarely spoke unless spoken to teachers worried about him. Of course, they'd make notes to check in, to call home, to suggest counseling. But with crowded classrooms and busy schedules, Eli often slipped through the cracks, just one more quiet child in a sea of noise. Sam Miller noticed him. From the first week Eli arrived, Sam watched as the boy arrived early, long before the buses pulled in. Eli would perch on the low stone wall near the east playground, his knees pulled to his chest, reading a dog-eared book or staring off toward the tree line. When the lunch bell rang, Sam saw the way Eli lingered near the bench, pretending to tie his shoes while the other kids rushed to the cafeteria. It was a familiar kind of hunger, Sam thought. Not just the kind in the belly, though, that too, but the kind that comes from a hollow place inside the ache of feeling alone. So Sam began quietly to act. It started with half a sandwich left on the stone bench each morning, then an apple wrapped carefully in a napkin, a bottle of water, a cookie now and then. Sam never said a word, never called attention to what he was doing, and Eli, for his part, never asked. But over the weeks, an unspoken ritual grew between them, a quiet exchange that required no explanation. What few people realized was how much Eli had already lost in his short life. His father, once a steady figure in his world, had slowly disappeared after the divorce. First in weekend visits canceled at the last minute, then in birthday cards that stopped coming. His mother, Anna, worked long hours at a local diner trying to keep them afloat. She was a good mother, a loving mother, but stretched so thin that Eli often became the quiet shadow in the house, tiptoeing around the edges of her exhaustion. Eli didn't complain. He didn't make scenes. He packed his own lunches when there was food in the pantry and made do when there wasn't. He figured out early on how to get himself to the bus stop, how to fold his clothes, just so how to blend into the background so the world wouldn't press down on him any harder. But children, even quiet ones, notice kindness. When Eli found that first sandwich, his fingers hovered over it for a long moment before he picked it up. He looked around, not suspicious, just puzzled. And when he caught sight of Sam halfway across the yard pushing his mop cart, their eyes met for just a second. Sam tipped his head, barely a nod. Eli, in turn, gave the smallest of smiles before tucking the sandwich into his backpack. It was the beginning of something Eli hadn't had in a long time: consistency. And in a world that had felt so unsteady for so long, that quiet, steady presence mattered more than anyone could have guessed. At first, Sam Miller's quiet offerings to Eli Thompson were just that: quiet. A sandwich here, an apple there, maybe a cookie wrapped carefully in wax paper. Sam would place them on the stone bench near the east playground each morning as part of his routine, just as he swept the walkways or checked the doors. He didn't overthink it, and he certainly didn't expect anything in return. It was just something a man did when he saw a child who needed help. But Eli noticed for the first few days Eli approached the bench cautiously, glancing around before reaching for the sandwich. He never tore into it quickly. Instead, he tucked it carefully into his backpack as though it were something precious, something to be saved. As the days passed, the nervous glances faded. Eli began to expect the small meal waiting for him, not with entitlement, but with a kind of quiet gratitude that showed in the slight softening of his usually downcast eyes. Sam never mentioned the food, and Eli never spoke of it. But as winter settled over Oakridge Elementary, their silent ritual became something steady in a world that often felt unpredictable, especially for Eli. One cold Tuesday morning, everything shifted. Sam returned from repairing a classroom heater and pushed open the door to his small maintenance room. There just inside lay a piece of folded paper, carefully slipped under the door. The paper was worn at the edges, the handwriting neat but slightly shaky. "Thank you for the sandwiches. My dad was a Marine too. I don't know if he's alive anymore, but you remind me of him." Sam sat on the edge of his stool, the note trembling slightly in his calloused hands. He read it once, then twice. For a long moment, he simply sat in the quiet hum of the maintenance room, eyes fixed on the words. It was the first time in years that something had cracked through the thick shell of solitude he had built around himself. He hadn't known Eli's full story, only what he could piece together from observation, but now the words in the note pulled old memories to the surface. Sam knew what it meant to wait for a father who might never walk through the door again. He knew the heavy silence that came in place of answers. That night, Sam did something he hadn't done in years. He baked. In his tiny kitchen under the hum of the old ceiling fan, he made a batch of chocolate chip cookies, carefully packing 2 into a small bag. The next morning, instead of the usual sandwich wrapped in wax paper, Eli found a small lunch, carefully prepared turkey on homemade bread, a polished red apple, a bottle of water, and those 2 still warm cookies. From across the playground, Sam saw the boy's eyes widen just slightly as he opened the bag. Eli didn't look around. This time he just sat on the bench, unwrapped the sandwich, and took a slow, deliberate bite. Sam turned away to give the boy his moment, but something settled in his chest, something warm and steady. Over the weeks that followed, the quiet exchanges continued, but now with small acknowledgments threaded in. Eli would give a quick wave across the schoolyard, and Sam would lift his hand in a gesture that hovered somewhere between a salute and a tip of his cap. Still no words were spoken, but in those small gestures, something unspoken grew. Eli began lingering near Sam during recess, sometimes pretending to examine a loose piece of playground equipment while Sam worked nearby. Once Eli watched silently as Sam fixed the latch on a swinging gate. Sam handed him a screwdriver, motioning for him to hold it steady. Eli's face lit up with quiet pride when the gate clicked back into place. They didn't need long conversations. In fact, they didn't need conversation at all. For both of them, the shared silences said everything. For Sam, it was a chance to offer the kind of steady presence he wished more men had offered him when he was Eli's age. Not loud advice or flashy gestures, but quiet, reliable care. For Eli, it was a lifeline, a daily reminder that someone saw him, that someone remembered. The bond they built was woven from the smallest threads, a sandwich, a cookie, a wave across the playground. But over time, it became unshakable. And while the world around them continued as usual, with spelling tests and recess games and parent-teacher conferences, this quiet connection between an old Marine and a lonely boy became something extraordinary. Neither of them knew that soon the entire school would come to understand just how deep that bond ran. But for now, in the quiet mornings and simple routines, they had found something rare, the healing power of being seen. It was an ordinary Monday morning at Oakridge Elementary, or so everyone thought. The hum of classroom chatter filled the hallways. Teachers scribbled last-minute notes on whiteboards, and Sam Miller was in the cafeteria wrestling with a stubborn mop bucket that refused to roll straight. Across the playground, Eli Thompson was in his usual place near the stone bench, the small lunch Sam had come to count on, tucked carefully into his backpack. Everything felt routine until the first black SUV pulled up in front of the school. At first, no one noticed. The school secretary glanced out the window, assuming it was a delivery truck. But then came the second SUV, then the third, and then the fourth. By the time the fourth vehicle eased into the fire lane, teachers were peering through classroom blinds. Students were pressing their faces to the windows, and even Sam paused, mop in hand, his brow furrowing. And then they saw them, 12 U.S. Marines in full dress, blues stepped out, boots clicking sharply against the pavement, white gloves, immaculate medals gleaming in the winter sun. At their head was Captain David Ramirez, his face calm, eyes focused, posture, ramrod straight. Whispers spread through the school like wildfire. Who were they here for? Was there an assembly no one knew about, a military visit for Veterans Day? But then the unthinkable happened. The line of Marines in perfect formation marched not to the front office, not to the principal's door, but straight toward the side of the building where Sam Miller had just emerged from the cafeteria, confused, wiping his hands on an old rag. Sam froze. For a heartbeat, the entire school froze with him. Captain Ramirez gave a sharp, respectful nod, and as if on cue, every Marine in the formation raised a perfect salute. Not to the principal, not to a general, but to Sam, the quiet janitor no one had ever imagined would command such respect. Principal Caldwell hurried down the hallway, eyes wide. "Sam, what's going on?" she whispered, voice tight with surprise. Sam shook his head slightly, as bewildered as everyone else. Captain Ramirez stepped forward, removing his cap as he crossed the last few feet between them. "Mr. Miller," his voice was calm but carried the weight of deep respect. "Captain David Ramirez, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." Sam squared his shoulders automatically, old instincts stirring. "Yes, sir. We're here to honor you, sir," Ramirez said softly. "For what you've done for Sergeant Michael Thompson's son." The name hit Sam like a punch to the chest. Michael Thompson, a name Sam hadn't heard in years yet, one etched deep into his memory. Michael had been part of the same transport division Sam had helped train decades earlier. Young, determined, always first in line for the hardest job, Sam had written the protocols. Michael had lived them on the battlefield, and now Michael's son Eli was the quiet boy Sam had been quietly feeding. Without ever knowing the full connection, Ramirez's voice softened. "Before Sergeant Thompson's last deployment, he made us promise that if anything happened to him, we'd check on his family. It took time to track them down, but when we found out someone here had been watching over his son, we knew we had to come." Sam's jaw tightened and his eyes burned with the sharp sting of emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to bury. The entire school, teachers, students, parents who had gathered after hearing the news watched in stunned silence as Ramirez extended a small polished wooden box. Inside, resting on deep blue velvet, was Sergeant Thompson's unit patch service medals and a photo of his squad. Young men in dusty combat gear, smiles wide despite the weight of war. And standing at the center of that photo, younger but unmistakable, was Sam Miller himself. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Eli emerged slowly from the crowd, small hands clutching the straps of his backpack, his eyes wide and brimming with understanding. He approached Sam cautiously, looking between the photo and the old man who had been quietly caring for him all these months. "You knew my dad," Eli whispered. Sam knelt carefully, knees stiff, voice rough with emotion. "Not directly, son, but in the Marines. We're all connected." Eli's face crumpled into a trembling smile, and Sam rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. As the applause spread through the crowd, slow at first, then rising into a wave that filled the schoolyard, Sam gave a small, tired smile. He hadn't wanted attention, hadn't wanted recognition. He had only wanted to make sure a quiet, hungry boy didn't feel forgotten. But in that moment, Sam Miller understood sometimes the smallest acts echo the loudest. And sometimes the Marines come back not for medals, not for ceremonies, but to honor the quiet heroes who never stopped serving. In the days following the Marines' unforgettable arrival at Oakridge Elementary, the small town was buzzing with a kind of energy it hadn't felt in years. The story of Sam Miller and Eli Thompson spread like wildfire, first through the school, then across town, and soon to news outlets that called nonstop hoping for an interview. But Sam, true to his nature, kept his head down. He returned to work as usual, sweeping the hallways, fixing leaky faucets, and keeping his quiet watch over the school. When reporters showed up, Sam slipped away to the maintenance room, or out the back door, waving off the principal's offers to arrange a statement. "Not my style," he'd say with a small smile. Never was. But while Sam quietly carried on, the community around him began to change. The school's Parent-Teacher Association organized a fundraiser within days. Tables were set up in the school gym, local businesses pitched in prizes, and parents brought in home-cooked meals to sell. The goal was simple: create a scholarship fund in honor of Sergeant Michael Thompson, ensuring Eli's education would be covered through college. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in not only from Oakridge, but also from neighboring towns, old Marines from Sam's unit, and strangers moved by the story online. By the end of the week, the scholarship fund had far exceeded its initial goal. Eli Thompson, once the quiet boy on the playground, now had a bright academic future secured. But the community didn't stop there. When Anna Thompson, Eli's mother, stepped onto the stage at the scholarship event, her hands trembled as she held the microphone. She thanked everyone for their generosity and confessed how hard it had been trying to rebuild their lives after Michael's death. What she didn't know was that behind the scenes, local veterans and community leaders had been working on a second surprise housing assistance. Within 2 weeks, Anna and Eli moved into a small but comfortable home just 2 blocks from the school. A home that gave Eli stability and gave Anna a fresh start. Sam kept his distance from the spotlight, but the effect he had was undeniable. The people of Oakridge found themselves drawn together, reminded of what it meant to look out for each other. And at the heart of it all was a quiet janitor who had shown them that sometimes the most powerful acts of service happen in the smallest, most unnoticed ways. For Sam, that was enough. In the months following the Marines' visit, life at Oakridge Elementary settled back into its usual rhythm, but something had quietly shifted. The school, once just a place of routine learning, had become a place of connection. And at the center of that change was Sam Miller. Despite the attention he'd received, Sam remained humble. But Principal Caldwell saw something in Sam she hadn't before. Not just a hardworking janitor, but a man with knowledge, experience, and a deep sense of responsibility that could inspire the students. So with some gentle persuasion, Sam agreed to start a basic mechanics elective for the middle schoolers. Every Thursday afternoon, a group of eager kids gathered in the old maintenance room, where Sam patiently taught them how to change a tire fix, a leaky faucet, and understand the basics of engines and tools. But more than practical skills, Sam shared something deeper: the values that had guided his life: responsibility, patience, and always looking out for the person beside you. The class became so popular that parents started asking for evening workshops. Sam just chuckled, shaking his head, but anyone who watched him with the kids could tell he was in his element. Meanwhile, news of Sam's quiet heroism reached the highest levels of the Marine Corps. In a formal letter from the commandant, Sam learned that his old transport protocols, long nicknamed Miller's Rules by those who knew him, were being officially added to the Marine Corps training manuals. His methods, once born out of necessity and instinct, were now shaping a new generation of Marines, ensuring that the values of caution, care, and leaving no one behind would live on. Perhaps the most touching tribute came in the form of a garden. At the edge of the school playground, where the old stone bench still sat, the community built the Thompson-Miller Friendship Garden, a quiet, beautiful space filled with flowers, a small flagpole, and a bronze plaque. The plaque read, "In honor of 2 Marines, one past, one fallen, who showed us that quiet acts of kindness change lives." Eli and Anna often sat there, sometimes joined by Sam, sometimes by students curious to hear his stories. It became a place of learning, of remembering, and of healing. And though Sam never sought recognition, he left behind something far greater: a legacy of service, humility, and heart that would ripple through Oakridge for generations to come. As we reflect on Sam Miller's story, we're reminded that the greatest acts of service often happen without applause, cameras, or headlines. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to assume that heroism looks like grand gestures or viral moments. But Sam teaches us otherwise. He shows us that kindness is built on consistency, that caring for someone quietly can have a ripple effect far beyond what we imagine, and that watching over the most vulnerable among us is a duty that belongs to all, not just a chosen few. For older adults watching this story carries a special message. Many of you have spent your lives building families, communities, and workplaces, often without fanfare. Sam's story honors that quiet strength, the kind that changes lives in simple ways, like sharing a meal, offering time, or teaching a skill. It reminds us that no matter our age or circumstances, we can still leave a powerful impact. But here's the question I want to leave with all of you. In your own life, who has been your Sam Miller? Or perhaps who have you quietly cared for without expecting anything in return? Share your stories in the comments. Let's fill this space with real-life reminders that kindness still thrives in our communities. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Thank you for spending your time with us, and remember, sometimes the smallest acts leave the largest legacies.